Welcome to Annotation Codex. I'm your host, Amy Cheek, sharing with you my margin notes on philosophy, occultism, religion, literature, poetry, and politics. Today's article is called Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Religious Relativism, and Brennan Lee Mulligan's Mom, which explores how a poetic faith reconciles the spiritual to the rational. Let's begin. In the Mythical Kitchen episode, Brennan Lee Mulligan eats his last meal. Host Josh Scherer asks the comedian, actor, writer, and game master, whom you should recognize from Dropout and Critical Role, how he reconciles being a stone-cold atheist while still being drawn to religious traditions and spirituality. Mulligan reminisces on his childhood, presenting his mother as someone capable of embodying these seemingly incompatible traits without strain.
My mom said a great thing because my mom was a totally awesome. She loves science. She's a skeptical, rational person. And we did like Beltane rituals growing up, spring pagan stuff. You know, Celtic paganism is great in terms of searching for, there's not a lot of mysticism to hide behind. Sort of like Manon and MacLear, 13-foot tall god of the sea, lives in a castle, 8 golden rams. Are you in or you out? You in or you out, baby?
Oh, you know I'm in.
There's not a Gnostic text of Manon and MacLear. You know, there's not like, maybe Manonan is a metaphor for it. It's like, it's like, you know, it's a piece of poetry. But what I love is my mom said this great thing when I was asking her about kind of like ritual. You know, if we don't believe in the supernatural, what the fuck are we doing out here doing rituals for? And she said, you only have to believe for the length of the ritual. And what I love about that is it sort of tells you sometimes you need a little bit of poetry. Sometimes you need to believe that there is light in the world and that it's with you in a given moment. But I think it's really important for a lot of reasons, a lot of them having to do with kindness, to keep those lines really clean. Because if you start to take the poetic truths out of poetry land and you go like, the light shines on me, that's why I'm rich. And if you're poor, it means the light's not shining on you.
Yes.
There are moments where you have to go, hey, drop the poetry for a second. Come be in the real world with me, right?
Yeah.
Don't bring the poetry into the practical, but also don't live a life without poetry. Maybe that's the lesson.
His mother's juxtaposition of rationality and spirituality is a compelling way to account for how atheistic or agnostic ritual can be possible. A prolific theater artist like Mulligan is perhaps an unsurprising messenger for this concept of stepping in and out of credulity. Theater students learn in performance theory about the suspension of disbelief, a phrase coined by 19th century Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In Biographia, Literaria, Coleridge explains the difference between Wordsworth's approach to poetry and his own. Whereas Wordsworth set out to impart the mundane, natural world with a sense of transcendent wonder, Coleridge set out to explore the supernatural, but to anchor it in what is familiar to human nature. Coleridge says, "My endeavors should be directed to persons and characters supernatural, or at least romantic, yet so as to transfer from our inward nature a human interest in a semblance of truth sufficient to procure for these shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith." When an audience senses that they are partaking in something that deeply resonates with the experience of being human, it doesn't matter that the piece of art isn't true in the sense of being literally accurate. They are willing to relinquish their skepticism and immerse themselves in the world of their story. To use The Lord of the Rings as an example, we don't care that Middle-earth is not a real place, or that it's populated by fantastical creatures that have never existed, hobbits, orcs, dragons, a primordial spider demon, etc. However, we do care that immeasurable darkness can be defeated by small and determined individuals who band together in the name of hope. The story can be true, faithful to the human experience, without being true, literally accurate. The suspension of disbelief expressed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and echoed in Brennan Lee Mulligan's mother's justification, "You only have to believe for the length of the ritual," aptly describes where I've landed when it comes to matters of religion and spirituality. I'm comfortable claiming in my spiritual life what Coleridge calls poetic faith. I extrapolate that phrase beyond literary criticism to indicate a rational agnosticism that doesn't need the supernatural to be literally accurate in order for a person to have a spiritual experience. By now, I've deconstructed out of a rigid evangelical Christian upbringing and have renounced Christianity altogether. I'm comfortable saying that biblical accounts of God, miracles, and the divinity of Christ are impossible to confirm and unlikely to be true, and even if they were, I'd still have very personal reasons to reject salvation on those terms. More broadly, if religious experiences do occur, I don't believe they are transferable through explanation or imposed doctrine. And if the divine exists, it must be something that appears differently to each individual, and consequently has thousands of names. I find pagan pantheons, especially the ancient Greek, to be more inspiring than any of the monotheisms, mostly because they're comprised of a variety of deities who have different domains representing different facets of human nature, rather than a single god who claims to be superior to humanity in his benevolence, omnipotence, and omniscience. In my personal spiritual practice, I don't treat gods as externally existing entities. Is there a god out there called Hermes, who wears winged sandals and behaves as messenger or psychopomp? Is that true? Literally accurate? Probably not. And yet there are aspects of humanity's potential, and therefore aspects of my own, for which the name Hermes is a shorthand. Quick-wittedness, stealth, learning, industriousness, and love for animals, to name a few. For me, invoking Hermes is not the act of communicating with an external spirit. Instead, it is the act of cultivating the spirit of Hermes as an archetype within myself, focusing on one or more of the aforementioned domains in my own life, and initiating personal growth as a communicator, as a teacher, as a mischief maker, or in some other capacity. In short, I don't believe gods made humankind. I believe humankind made the gods, and rather than coldly walking the barren furrows of someone else's unverified personal gnosis, I prefer to mine the raw materials of those myths within myself and use them to construct meaning and pursue a kind of spirituality that can't be transferred to someone else. It works for me, and it only works for me. To that end, Mulligan's clean delineation of poetry versus the practical, or what I would call the spiritual versus the mundane, functions similarly to the separation of church and state. It protects others from being imposed upon. If I can admit that my poetic faith is born out of my own experience and shaped by myths, symbols, and archetypes of my choosing, it remains only applicable to me. It would be ridiculous to try to impose it upon someone else. I don't have this compulsion to prove to anyone else that my spiritual framework is literally accurate. I know it's not. I'm permanently unsure of the nature or even existence of the divine, and I'm at peace with that. I have instead a poetic faith that rings true in ways that matter to me, and that is enough. Would that the prevailing monotheisms could admit their own invention. What kind of religious tolerance would we start to see?